Stories from the East and West.
December 2nd, 1967, Cape Town, South Africa.
Late that afternoon, 25-year-old Denise Darvel and her mother are caught up in a terrible car accident. Her mother dies on impact. Denise is rushed to hospital. There, the doctors pronounce her brain dead.
In a quiet room, Denise's distraught father, Edward, sits down with two doctors and they break the news. Denise would never wake up. They softly mention an experimental procedure and ask him an extremely difficult question. Would he donate his daughter's still-beating heart to try to save a man's life?
The doctors leave Edward alone to be with his thoughts. But before long, he comes back to them. Edward says that if they can't save his daughter's life, then they should at least try to save this man's instead.
Even though it's 1 a.m, a surgeon called Christiaan Barnard painstakingly begins a 6-hour operation, leading a huge team of 30 people.
Barnard finally finishes at 7 a.m, and it's a milestone in medical history. The first successful heart transplant. The Darvel family's sacrifice had changed the medical world.
The patient, Louis Waszkanski, lives for only 18 days, but Barnard has proven without a doubt that this kind of radical surgery can be done. That those brave enough can prolong human life in the most remarkable way, taking a heart from one person and placing it into another.
This is a procedure that's done on patients in which we can do nothing else for. And if we accept it as a palliative procedure, not a curative procedure, then I think that we've done extremely well. And from here we will build up, solve some of the problems and develop new means of treatment until such a stage that it will be a curative procedure. The ill that's been suffered.
It's an amazing story, but South Africa isn't the Eastern West. It's more the Southern South.
Although, to be fair, the patient in that transplant, Louis Waszkanski, was actually born in Lithuania. But that's not the link for today's show.
No. Imagine trying to perform the same operation but with another level of difficulty. What if you wanted to make heart transplants happen, but you were being held back? Imagine you had no money, backward technology, and a useless infrastructure. On top of that, imagine you had the media and even all of society completely against you. How could you ever save people's lives with all of that? Hi, I'm Nitzan.
And I'm John.
And this is Stories from the Eastern West. Today's episode is about Zbigniew Religa, a surgeon who wanted to save lives despite everything working against him. Technology, public opinion, even the very infrastructure of the medical world he worked in.
Professor Religa said, no, we have to do it, because if we don't do it, the people who need our help will be dying.
To help us along the way, we have his former colleague, also called Zbigniew Nawrat.
I'm theoretical physicist by profession. I was his deputy for many years.
As well as a senior journalist.
My name is Dariusz Kortka. I'm an editor-in-chief of Gazeta Wyborcza in Katowice. Several years ago, we decided to write a book about Professor Religa.
Before we dive into Religa's story, we need some background to understand why the challenge ahead was so huge. During the following years, in the late 1960s, South Africa's landmark heart operation inspired many other countries to attempt their own transplants.
But not every country was the same back then, especially the ones behind the Iron Curtain. Held down by the USSR's Soviet regime, most of Eastern Europe was devoid of any political or personal freedom. Private industry was impossible, and civilizational progress had slowed to a crawl.
In one of these countries, Poland, Dr. Jan Mol thought he had everything he needed to perform a heart transplant too. But it didn't work out. Here's Dariusz Kortka on what happened.
In 1968, Professor Jan Mol in Łódź, in his clinic, he tried to do this, and he failed. And after this failure, he was accused of making experiments on patients. So the professors, especially from Warsaw, didn't allow to do it anymore.
It wasn't just a technical failure. It brought up old superstitions.
It was also opinion. Then everyone who will touch the heart will be cursed. Why? Because they had no opportunity to look at the heart, to open the chest and look how it looks like, how the heart works.
The media destroyed Moll, swaying public opinion even further against him. Newspapers were full of accusations that Moll was experimenting on people, and even writing that he had murdered his patient.
After seeing how he was treated, no other surgeon dared attempting the same. Everybody was too scared to try again.
What followed was almost 20 years of nothing. Other countries were advancing, with their transplants becoming more and more successful, and patients living longer and longer, but not the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union.
The USSR's Ministry of Health even put a ban on heart transplants. So, from East Berlin to Kamchatka, some 10,000 miles away, these kinds of operations had become taboo.
But one man decided things had to change.
Polish surgeons afraid of making such operations, but Professor Zbigniew Religa was really different.
Zbigniew Religa didn't care much about his own health. He was a major chain smoker, for example. Instead, he put all his focus into other people.
He was really brave, and he couldn't stand that a lot of patients who needed heart transplant operations were dying.
Religa knew that things could be done differently because he had seen them being done differently.
Professor Religa spent about 2 years or more in the US working with the master of cardiac surgery, Professor Adrian Kantrowicz. Professor Kantrowicz was very famous because work on transplantation and also on artificial heart.
When he came back to Poland, Religa wanted to start using all he had learnt in the United States.
But he was really convinced that he can do it, and he has to do it, because otherwise people will be dying.
But it was never going to be that simple. Back in Warsaw, he spoke with his boss at the hospital he had been assigned to.
He couldn't do it in Warsaw. He quarreled with his supervisor.
Trying to set up a heart unit in the country's capital, Warsaw, felt impossible. There were simply too many bureaucratic barriers in Poland and its communist regime. The private sector was banned and non-existent, so he was forced to do things through a state that was uninterested in progress.
Religa was getting impatient. He needed the red tape out of the way so that he could concentrate on the medical challenges of making transplants happen. He didn't care about political agendas.
He needed somewhere without rules.
He decided to go to Zabrze.
Zabrze is in south of Poland, in Silesia region, very industrial.
In 1984, Religa headed to Poland's Wild West.
And very dirty in 1980s, forgotten part of Poland, really unpleasant to live.
Zabrze may have been the Wild West, but it was a clean slate with hardly any oversight from the regime. Using his charm and forceful personality, Religa raised money from local organizations in town and quickly set up the heart unit.
He got to work. Everybody did.
In his clinic, the one principle was the most important: to give a good care to a patient. So it was on the first place.
Religa believed in total sacrifice towards helping patients, and that went for everybody who worked with him.
Professor Religa also lived in Zabrze alone. He left his family in Warsaw, so he couldn't come back home at certain time. You know, he didn't eat a dinner with the family, and he couldn't understand that his partners has to go to eat a supper with the children and the wives.
Religa was notorious for skipping meals and replacing them with even more cigarettes. He was a hard taskmaster on himself and demanded the same from his colleagues, even when it came to their own families.
People who worked in his clinic couldn't just get out of work because they finished their shift, the 8 or 12-hour shift, because it was always something to do with the patients.
Dariusz Kortko remembers one case in particular that really shows Religa's thinking. The case of Dr. Bochenek, whose wife was pregnant.
He came to Professor Religa and he told him that my wife is giving a birth. I need to be with her. And Professor Religa answered, why? Because you don't giving a birth to your child. She is giving. You are not needed in this place. So you have to stay here. And Professor Bochenek said, no, I can't be here. I have to be with my wife because it's a special moment for us. And Professor Religa let him go. But next day, during the morning meeting, he said, we have a patient in a bad condition, he's dying, and Professor Bochenek had to go to see his wife giving birth to his child. It's very interesting, isn't it?
At first, it sounds like Religa was not a very sympathetic person, but in fact, the opposite was true.
He would travel hundreds of kilometers, work days and nights, if there was a chance to save a single human life.
Religa felt their abilities and positions as doctors made them responsible for doing the best for other people, for the patient, no matter what. It was a personal code.
And it was paying off in droves.
Despite only being the size of Des Moines in Iowa, the town of Zabrze performed 500 open-heart surgeries in 1985. More operations took place there than in Poland's two biggest cities combined. It had become the place to go for heart problems.
Part of his success was that he threw away the rulebook for how a doctor was supposed to behave. Kortko explains.
In Poland, it was tradition from also 19th century that it was professor who was on the top of this pyramid, and it was impossible to go to the professor who was on the top. The ordinary physician couldn't go to the professor and tell him that he, for instance, want to make a surgery, that operation.
But for Religa, nothing was impossible.
Professor Religa was different. He gathered young people who wanted to learn, who wanted to do something new, and he let him do things that the people, the physicians in their age couldn't really think about.
It wasn't just young doctors who were amazed by his behavior, it was his patients.
He was really very open. His cabinet was always open to the patients. Everyone could come and talk to him just like that. He was talking with his patients on the corridors also. They really trusted him and believed in him.
But what about his holy grail, the heart transplant?
First off, it was all very well finding people with major heart problems who needed operating on. But finding donors?
Professor Religa and his people trying to call to these colleagues in the hospitals nearby, telling them that if you have a patient, for instance, with a brain tumor, let us know because we will take his heart. And they said, of course, no, we will not do it because it's illegal in Poland.
With no support from the state medical system, Religa had to resort to other means.
He did not hesitate to implant a pig's heart to helpless patients.
Yes, you heard that right. A pig's heart. Religa had heard about other doctors trying to use them in other countries, and he was desperate.
He tried to do it on dogs and the dead bodies.
But then, after all that morbid preparation, on November 5th, 1985, a rare opportunity to transplant an actual human heart finally arrived. A young man had been in a motorcycle accident. Receiving his heart was Józef Krawczyk, a farmer in his 60s.
Religa's whole team was spread across different rooms, working in one way or another on the operation. In one room, the donor, and next door was Krawczyk.
Religa cut out Krawczyk's old heart and inserted the new one. All the major valves were connected over the course of a painstaking 62 minutes. Krawczyk was defibrillated. The heart began to beat.
His team could barely believe what they were doing. Despite all their surgery experiences, they hadn't actually seen all this before. The empty rib cage, the sudden beating of a new heart.
But they all claimed that Religa was unfazed, acting with the precision and assuredness of a man who knew exactly what he wanted to do and how to do it.
And when Religa saw how much blood Kravchuk was losing, he knew what to do next.
He asked Professor Bochenek to call his wife and tell her to come and make a report about what they are doing in the hospital. And she was a journalist in a Polish radio.
It turned out Bochenek had called her near the beginning of the operation already. She had advised him that they should only announce what they were doing if it became clear that it was going to work.
Religa, with his typical bluntness, started swearing at Bochenek. He told him to call his wife right back and just tell her it was a success already.
Professor Bochenek said, but look at him, he is dying and we don't have even enough blood for him. Professor Religa said, tell Christina to announce that we need blood.
And so, Polish radio announced what was happening and asked for blood donors. Despite all their fears of what might happen, despite the way Jan Moll was treated back in '68, Religa's team didn't have to wait long for a reaction.
Thousands of people came to hospital and gave him blood.
The country went wild. Not only did Kravchuk get the blood he needed, but TV and magazines lined up outside the hospital, begging Religa for an interview. Religa's gamble had paid off.
In interviews with the Polish press, him sitting there casually smoking a cigarette, Religa repeated something in particular which charmed them.
I now no longer suffer from a complex about Western cardiosurgery. I believe we are now on the same level.
A major medical milestone for the Eastern Bloc had been made, just like the one in South Africa back in 1967. But also just like that milestone in South Africa, there were complications.
Six days after his transplant, Józef Kravchuk passed away. It turned out he had had an undiagnosed liver problem which had led to unexpected internal bleeding. His body couldn't take it.
The media immediately picked up on his death and went to Religa demanding he explain himself. This would have been the point that many doctors would have given up. After all, that's what Jan Moll had done back in 1968.
But Religa didn't look at the media the same way. He announced that Kravchuk had not just been an experiment. He told them he had another transplant patient ready who would be operated on the very next day. Despite their initial hesitation, the media accepted him, wanting to try again.
He took another patient.
But about a month later,
he also died.
This time from kidney failure. Religa didn't wait around and tried with a third patient.
And the third patient, who lived a couple of days, he also died.
It was a graft rejection. Either way, this third patient had survived for much less time than the first two. It didn't look good.
And after the third time, some people started thinking maybe we should finish this program because we can't do it. We can't do it. And Professor Religa said, no, we have to do it, because if we don't do it, the people who need our help will be dying. So he took a fourth patient.
And this fourth attempt?
After about a week's recovery, the patient walked out of the hospital on his own 2 feet.
Religa finally felt he had successfully completed a heart transplant. He had no doubts about it, as confirmed the next day by one of the nurses who lived near him in Zabrze.
She said that Religa had woken up half the neighborhood in the middle of the night. He had gone onto his balcony and shouted at the top of his voice,
"People! I did it!" Hey, shut up! Shut your trap!
But Religa didn't have time to bask in his glory.
Now that everybody's attention had been turned towards their work in Zabrze, and now that he had shown what was possible, Religa suddenly had a lot more people looking for help. He needed more donors.
But it was hard finding donors anywhere near Zabrze. With the demand increasing, Religa had to look further afield.
A perfect donor appeared, almost 400 miles away in the city of Szczecin.
Remember, we're talking about 1980s Poland, a place run into the ground by a communist regime uninterested in developing the country's infrastructure.
Even in 1980s, it was really very hard because we had no highways here, and the roads were in a very bad conditions. So the car needed 10 hours to take this road, but 10 hours is too long for the heart. So Professor Religa thought that maybe the army will help him.
Seeing as he had become a household name, suddenly he had connections.
And he called one of the generals of the Polish army, and he told him, I need a plane or a helicopter who will take the heart from Szczecin to Zabrze. And the general, he said, why not? We are doing our flights because we have to train. Maybe we'll do something good doing this.
The army actually helped them surprisingly regularly. Religa's assistant, Romuald Cichoń, once asked a soldier why they kept helping his boss whenever he called.
Either way, we have hours of flying time. If I'm supposed to fly to Bulgaria for 2 kilos of tomatoes, just because it takes the fancy of one of our wives, then honestly, it's better going for a heart instead.
His visionary outlook didn't stop there, though. Religa soon capitalized on his popularity to start a foundation. This foundation had one purpose: to build an artificial heart. The foundation, Fundacja Rozwoju Kardiologii, or FRK, has worked on its artificial heart goal since 1987.
Building an artificial heart was obviously going to be expensive. The foundation resorted to raising money in adventurous ways, typical of Religa's style.
In 1992, they managed to get Placido Domingo, one of the world's biggest classical music stars, to play in the town of Zabrze. This was at a time when stars of classical or pop music weren't touring Poland at all, let alone smaller cities like Zabrze. But it went so well that José Carreras played a year later in 1993.
Also, it's worth remembering that after communism finally fell in 1989, private businesses were suddenly allowed to blossom all over the country. It meant the foundation was able to get money from Poles who had started their own businesses, something impossible back when Religa had started his work in the early 1980s.
The end of communism also meant they could open up internationally and find foreign investors. For example, the foundation approached the widow of the founder of Johnson & Johnson and got her to agree to help.
Even though it still hasn't reached its ultimate goal of the artificial heart, the foundation has created a heart pump that has saved many lives.
LVD ventricalized devices have been in use since 1993, giving chance for life to almost 400 patients.
Unsurprisingly, Religa, a force of nature in Poland, was starting to become looked upon as a savior.
No wonder a recent film about his life was called Gods.
In the 1990s, when Poland had become a democratic country again, Religa even went into politics.
He became a member of parliament, a senator, and finally health minister.
In 2005, he even briefly tried to run for president of Poland. At the early stages, Religa was polling at 65%. But his numbers started to flag after other more professional politicians entered the race and he dropped out.
But in 2009, all those cigarettes that Religa had been smoking finally caught up with him. He died of lung cancer, aged 70.
With all the people he had wanted to help, it seems Religa really had forgotten to look after himself. It's safe to say that Zbigniew Religa was a rebel, but sometimes society needs rebels.
One person can defy a whole system and change established beliefs for the good.
We need people like Religa who break the status quo and advance society for the benefit of us all. People who don't care about what's in it for them.
He turned down a lucrative job offer in the US to create the foundation and model Polish cardiac surgery.
Determination and his dedication to people in need allowed one man to overcome immense difficulties and basically save thousands through his legacy.
People say that his greatest achievement was a heart transplant, but I think it is not true. I think his greatest achievement was that he created a school of modern cardiac surgery in Poland. He educated dozens of surgeons who are now working in cardiac surgery units spread all over the Poland. And many of them have already trained their students.
Religa always said that somebody else would have done it if it wasn't him. Whoever that would have been would have needed the same amount of heart.
This episode of Stories from the East and West was a Wirewalker studio production for Culture.pl. Our team included Wojciech Oleksiak, Adam Żuławski, Nitzan Reisner, John Beecham and Michael Keller. Many thanks to Dariusz Kortko and Dr. Zbigniew Navrat for talking to us in this episode about their experiences with Dr. Religa. We'd also like to thank the Professor Zbigniew Religa Foundation of Cardiac Surgery Development for all their help. You can find out more about them in the show notes. To see the notes from this episode, just tap the show art in your podcast app or visit storiesfromtheeastandwest.com. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to subscribe for future episodes. And remember to give us a review on Apple Podcasts. It'll help others find the podcast too.